Hey everyone, welcome to The New Populist. I'm Dave Brown. If you are new to this channel, please like and subscribe. Well, a couple of days ago, I made a video about Ted Cruz and discussing him calling the January 6th riot a terrorist attack. And one of the concerns I had in that video is that we were expanding the definition of terrorism to include more and more people, in this case, American citizens. And when someone is a terrorist, because of the Patriot Act, we have all these tools to be used against us. And my concern was that here we have a Republican senator, a conservative, sort of gifting this Department of Justice and the Democrats this expanded definition of terrorism that could be used against us. And to make my point, here we have, just a few days later, the DOJ with their Domestic Terrorism Department now that they're going to be using to investigate domestic terrorism, or to ratchet up their efforts to find domestic terrorists. And what exactly did the DOJ say? And here is part of their statement. Last week, we marked the one-year anniversary of the violent attack on the Capitol on January 6th. In the wake of that attack, DOJ has undertaken an effort unprecedented in its scope and complexity to hold accountable all who engage in criminal acts. As the Attorney General described last week, we have arrested and charged more than 725 individuals, including more than 325 defendants charged with felonies for their roles in the January 6th attack. We continue to methodically gather and review the evidence, and we will follow the facts wherever they lead. The attacks in recent years underscore the threat that domestic terrorism continues to pose to our citizens, to law enforcement officers and elected officials, and to our democratic institutions. Based on the assessment of the intelligence community, we face an elevated threat from domestic violent extremists. That is, individuals in the United States who seek to commit violent criminal acts in furtherance of domestic, social, or political goals. Domestic violent extremists are often motivated by a mix of ideologies and personal grievances. We have seen a growing threat from those who are motivated by racial animus, as well as those who ascribe to extremist, anti-government, and anti-authority ideologies. We also remain vigilant to the persistent threat from international terrorist groups, particularly Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Now, I like at the end there where they remind us that they're still focused on terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Does anybody feel particularly threatened by either one of those organizations right now? It sort of seems that those two groups all of a sudden disappeared when this pandemic started, when the media changed their focus to coronavirus. So I personally don't feel that threatened by Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And it seems that our federal government is not too concerned about Al-Qaeda and ISIS because they are focused on domestic terrorists, people who are anti-government and anti-authority. And in itself, what's wrong with being anti-government and anti-authority? Our entire country was based off of a group of people who were anti-government and anti-authority, and they created a constitution that protected the people from government. And people forget that the Constitution doesn't give us rights; it protects our rights from a government. So it's the other way around there. Now, we can go back to 2000, I think 2 or 1, when the Patriot Act was first brought into law. And back then, we were warned that the Patriot Act could infringe upon our civil liberties. And of course, one of the people who voted against it was Ron Paul. Listen to what Ron Paul says here.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this bill. I was opposed to the Patriot Act in 2001 and do not believe now that it's a good idea to extend it. You know, the Fourth Amendment is rather clear. It says that we should be secure in our papers, our persons, our homes, and our effects. And that if warrants are to be issued, we have to do it with probable cause and describe in particular the places, the people, and the things that we're going to look at. And I think what has happened, though, over the years has been that we have diluted the Fourth Amendment. It was greatly diluted in 2001, but it started a lot earlier than that. When the FISA law was originally written in 1978, that really introduced the notion that the Fourth Amendment was relative and not absolute. And later on, it was further weakened in 98, and then, of course, in 2001. I think our reaction to the horrors of 9/11, we can understand the concern and the fear that was developed, but I think the reaction took us in the wrong direction, because the assumption was made, of course, that we weren't spending enough money on surveillance, and even though then our intelligence agencies received $40 billion, they didn't give us the right information. So now we're spending $80 billion. But it also looks like the conclusion was that the American people had too much privacy. And if we undermine the American people's privacy, somehow or another, we're going to be safer. I think another thing that has come up lately has been that the purpose of government is to make us perfectly safe. Now, it is good to be safe, but governments can't make us safe. I question whether or not we have been made safer by the Patriot Act, but let's say a law makes us somewhat safer. Is that a justification for the government to do anything they want? For instance, if you want to be perfectly safe from child abuse and wife beating, the government could put a camera in every one of our houses and our bedrooms, and maybe there would be somebody made safer this way, but what would you be giving up? So perfect safety is not the purpose of government. What we want from government is to enforce the law and to protect our liberties. This, to me, has been, especially since 9/11, a classical example of sacrificing liberty for safety and security. Now, I didn't invent those terms. They've been around a long time, and it's easily justified, and I can understand it, because I was here in 2001 when this came up, and people become frightened. The American people want something done, but I think this is misdirected and not, it doesn't serve our benefits. So I think at this time we should really question why we're extending this. We're extending the three worst parts. Why were these sunsetted? Because people had concern about them. They weren't sure they were good pieces, and maybe they were overkill, and therefore they were saying, we better reassess it. So what have we done? We have already extended it twice, and here we're going to do it again with the intent, I think, in a year to reassess this. But this bill doesn't make things worse. It doesn't make anything better, but it does extend what I consider and others consider bad legislation. I ask for a no vote on this legislation.
I think it's funny that he brings up the 1978 FISA, because now we have in 2016 the FISA being used against Donald Trump. So it took about 35 years for that FISA Act to come full circle to be used illegally against a presidential candidate. So Ron Paul mentioned that in 2001 when he talked about the Patriot Act, and here we have it in 2016 affecting Donald Trump, and now the Patriot Act 2022, we have the Domestic Terrorism Unit. So it all comes full circle, and we were warned, and we should have been paying attention. And I think it's funny too, because back during the Bush administration, the ACLU was, this is when they were very left-wing, but they weren't completely controlled by the establishment. And at the time, they were still relatively trying to protect civil liberties. And they actually had a critique of the Patriot Act, and they were critiquing it in the context of protecting the rights of left-wing activists. And I want to go through this article because it talks about the expanded definition of terrorism and what's in the Patriot Act that can be used against American citizens who are defined as domestic terrorists. So let's take a look at this article here from the ACLU. How the USA Patriot Act redefines domestic terrorism. And it says, Section 802 of the U.S. Patriot Act expanded the definition of terrorism to cover domestic as opposed to international terrorism. A person engages in domestic terrorism if they do an act dangerous to human life that is in violation of the criminal laws of a state or the United States. If the act appears to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. Additionally, the acts have to occur primarily within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States, and if they do not, may be regarded as international terrorism. So here we have this expanded definition, and this goes in opposition to what international terrorism is. This is now people who are engaging in coercion, trying to affect the population through acts of terror, however they're defined. It goes on, Section 802 does not create a new crime of domestic terrorism. However, it does expand the type of conduct that the government can investigate when it's investigating terrorism. The USA Patriot Act expanded governmental powers to investigate terrorism, and some of these powers are applicable to domestic terrorism. And it goes on to say, the definition of domestic terrorism is broad enough to encompass the activities of several prominent activist campaigns and organizations. And they go on to mention Greenpeace and WTO protesters. So according to the ACLU, this expanded definition of domestic terrorism could cover activists. And as we're seeing now, it's being used to cover not just left-wingers, but right-wingers as well. And so if you're a quote-unquote domestic terrorist, or you're being investigated as a domestic terrorist, I talked about that those tools the government has to use against you when they give you that definition. And what are those tools? Well, it goes on to say here, it talks about your asset forfeiture. And it says, the civil asset forfeiture power of the United States government is awesome. The government can seize and or freeze the assets on the mere assertion that there is a probable cause to believe that the assets were involved in domestic terrorism. The assets are seized before a person is given a hearing, and often without notice. In order to permanently forfeit the assets, the government must go before a court, but at a civil hearing, and the government is only required to prove that the assets were involved in terrorism by a preponderance of the evidence. Because it is a civil proceeding, a person is not entitled to be represented by an attorney at public expense if they cannot afford to pay an attorney. The time between seizure and forfeiture can sometimes be months. Meanwhile, organizations or individuals whose assets are seized are forced to make do without the assets. Now, imagine that. You're accused of being a domestic terrorist, and you have your assets seized and frozen, and they won't give you an attorney. If you can't afford one, well, you're screwed. You have to, I guess, represent yourself. And again, this can possibly happen. We always talk about fast forwarding 5 or 10 years. So this article was written actually a bit a while ago, but now that we've had this Domestic Terrorism Unit and all these DOJ lawyers focused on that, these are some of the tools they have to use against people they call domestic terrorists. What else can they do? Disclosure of educational records. This provision, Section 507, this provision of the U.S. Patriot Act requires a judge to issue an order permitting the government to obtain private educational records if the Attorney General or his designee certifies that the records are necessary for investigating domestic or international terrorism. No independent judicial finding is required to verify that the records are relevant. This means that the Attorney General may obtain the private educational records of a student involved in the VA case protest by asserting that the records are relevant to a domestic terrorist organization. These records may include information such as students' grades, private medical information, which organization that the student belonged to, or any other information that the educational institution collects about its students. So now they can grab your private assets, they can look at your educational records, and the last thing here they can do is Section 508, Disclosure of Information from National Education Statistics Act. This provision of the USA Patriot Act requires a judge to issue an order for the government to obtain educational records that have been collected pursuant to the National Education Statistics Act. And the NESA includes a vast amount of identifiable student information from academic performance to health information, family income, and race. Until now, this information has been held to strictly confidential requirements without exception. Again, all the government needs to certify is that the information is relevant to a terrorism investigation and that the court had no choice but to issue the order. And one of the last things here too is the search warrants. And basically here it says that they can go to one jurisdiction to ask for a search warrant, but then they can go all over the country to actually use a search warrant. So it says here, this section of the U.S. Patriot Act amends Rule 41A of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure to authorize the government to go before a single federal magistrate judge in any judicial district in which activities relating to the terrorism may have occurred to obtain a warrant to search property or person within or outside the district. This means that the government can go to a single judge to get a warrant to search the property or person of a VA case activist in New York, Chicago, California, or wherever else the protesters were from. If the government chose to go before a magistrate in New York, a person in California who wished to seek to have the warrant quashed because he or she believed it was valid would have to find a way to appear before the New York court that issued the warrant. So they issue a warrant in one state, and if you want to challenge it and you're across the country, you got to get on an airplane and fly across the country to challenge it, which of course, as they point out, is a problem for a lot of people. So these are all the tools the government has if they designate you a domestic terrorist. And so again, this is my frustration when a senator on our side joins in with the mainstream media and the left in calling us or calling January 6th a terrorist attack, because he's basically gifting them this whole set of tools to use against us with this expanded definition. And we've seen with the people that were been held in solitary confinement in DC that there's very few people who actually care and are actually fighting to see what happened with them. McConnell? Where has McConnell been the last 9 months? Has he spoken up against for anybody who's been held in solitary confinement? We have, I think, Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene. So if the government uses these tools against us, we're by ourselves. We're on our own. We're screwed. Because if we're waiting for the Republican Party to jump in and try to protect our rights, well, we have someone like Ted Cruz actually giving him more power, giving the DOJ more power to come against us, using the Patriot Act that Ron Paul warned us about almost 20 years ago now. So everything the government attains as far as power is at some point used against us. It may not be a year, it may not be 5 years, but eventually it comes full circle and we're screwed. So we are warned and we better pay attention going forward. That's it for now. Again, if you are new to this channel, please like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.